Hey everyone, this is Kai for ItsAMansWorldFTM1, week 29. This week's topic is transmedia. List examples of trends in media. How do you feel about it and how do you think it affects the trans community? Okay, so let's talk about the few examples I've encountered in transmedia. Media can be anything. Movies, television shows, news, books, whatever. As far as I know, the only example I've only encountered maybe a handful of examples of transmedia in popular media. So if you look at movies, for example, there's a few examples, and some of them are very old, and by very old I mean more than 10 years, because media is being created at such an amazing rapidity. I mean, look at YouTube. There's new content any second of the day. So considering how fast media is created in the modern world, anything beyond a couple years kind of becomes old. If you consider old movies, there's one called Glen or Glenda, I think, in which they took a true story of the first medical transgender, and it became a fairy tale. It was so dramatized, and there was so much artistic license that it ceased to be real. It ceased to be like a documentary, and it just became a fantastical story with romance elements and bullying. It really felt, if you've ever watched it, it really feels like one of those like after-school specials or one of those programs that they show you at school to show you how dangerous driving is, that's just over-dramatized. So as a trans person, it really annoyed me that it's just so fake. A few years later, about 30 years or something, no, like 20, they did, the name escapes me, I'll put it in the comments, but the story was about a man who fell in love with a woman who turned out to not be a woman, who turned out to be pre-op transgender. And as you know, when he found out, I believe he kills her because he's just like, oh, like I'm totally homo and craziness. Death. I believe the trans person in question was a sex worker. Before recent times, more you know, there was a large influx of trans people in the sex industry, because it was the only way via which they could earn an income, due to the fact that people were refusing to give them jobs and they were considered monsters or whatever. And there was no security. In the 70s and 80s, it was very dangerous to be transgender, particularly a trans woman, because trans women, on the average, tend to have a harder time or pass due to the fact that they were, more often than not, more obvious, since they didn't have the ability to really transition during youth to have more masculine features to start with, and therefore they would have a hard time passing. The risk of death and abuse, losing their job, losing their house, and so on, was much higher. During that time period, a lot of them had to become sex workers just to make a living, to kind of prey on the fetishism of others. If you look at older media, you're only going to find trans women, because the idea of trans men just never existed. If there were trans men, maybe they expressed their gender through their sexuality by becoming stone butches, for example. A stone butch is, not in every case, but in some cases, a masculine woman. They're called stone butches, I believe, because they are the aggressors in the relationship and they don't like being touched, which could be a sign of dysphoria, in my opinion. It is my opinion, or my experience. There's a subsection of the lesbian culture that is sort of based on very masculine presenting women who still maybe identify as women or don't know that there are options, and therefore they just say, well, I'm going to be a woman, I'm still in love with women, but I'm not going to allow them to touch me, maybe because I have dysphoria about my sexual organs. But beyond that, there hasn't really been much exposure about transgendered men in movies before the 90s. Or media before the 90s. Maybe it's because trans men tend to pass better, so maybe it was just an unknown in popular culture. Then there was Boys Will Cry, where there was a male-identified female-bodied person who was like a redneck and really didn't know that there were options, or maybe there weren't options about how to pursue medical transition. And she falls in love with a girl and pretends to be a guy and passes at that even during intercourse, you know, because it's dark. And she has a strap on. And people find out and she gets killed. Oh, boo-hoo, shit, sad, fuck. It's annoying that in these examples of transmedia, people die and they're abused and they either die or they're abused, and they're considered second-class citizens, but maybe not even citizens, maybe not even second class, and it certainly creates fear and panic within the popular eye, because that's what they know. Ooh, trans women are evil and weird, and they're trying to trick us, and therefore we should kill them. Or trans men are evil and weird, and they're sleeping with our girlfriends, and therefore we should kill them, and so on. So in older media, it doesn't end well for the trans person. And they're usually depicted as liars or deceivers, and some kind of weird Frankenstein's monster, and that's not cool. If we look at slightly more recent media, we have things like the L Word. There's a character in the L world who's a trans man who is going through transition on the show. I kind of really don't want to talk about it, but I was watching the L Word when I was still identifying as a lesbian, and when I saw this trans character, I was intrigued by the idea, but again, I don't know how to add, so I didn't put two and two together. But I was very annoyed at how the character was depicted, maybe because I knew internally that I was trans, and the way that the character was depicted, I found it kind of offensive. And when people come up to you and you say, oh, I'm trans, and they go, oh, I know, like that character from the L Word, I want to punch them, because I'm not like that freaking character on the L Word. And I'm not saying that maybe there aren't people out there who can relate to that story, but I can't relate to that story, and so I find the story really offensive. But I can't relate to anybody on that show, so I find the show kind of offensive. The character, I think, is from the Midwest, and is hitchhiking around the country, and starts taking black market tea, and starts changing, but has no control about their hormones, and start fucking everything. And it's just a shitty character, and I really hate the character because the character is weak, and the character is stupid, and the character does everything wrong, but everybody around them is really excited about them transitioning and seems very positive, except for some flack from the lesbian community about betraying them. I don't remember. I hated it so much I don't really recall. Beyond the character being trans, there's nothing good about the character. And so when people come up and they like the character and they get excited about it, and they're like, oh, I can relate you to something that I know, and therefore you're acceptable. I don't want that to be an example of acceptable trans exposure in the media. But then if we go into less popular media, there's lots of trans exposure. There's exposure on YouTube. Literally, you cannot Google the word trans without seeing at least 600 intro videos. So that's media. There's lots of that. And some of it's good and some of it's bad because it's user-created content and there's very little control about what people say. But it's an individual story, so at least people are hopefully being honest, and we get to see a lot of different variations of the trans journey that is not limited to what producers decide is acceptable or dramatized television to engage audience with shock factor. Oh, what's her name? Lana Wachowski? One of their siblings who wrote and directed The Matrix and Cloud Atlas and all that stuff. One of them was living privately as trans and came out as trans and had an amazing speech on the Human Rights Foundation that talked about how The Matrix, while being a sci-fi action film, talks a lot about identity and how, I believe her name is Lana, and I can't remember her name right. I'm so sorry. She's so amazing. But it talks about the fact that she felt that her gender was being expressed publicly the same way that Neo was when he was living in the corporate world in The Matrix. How she was trying to assimilate and fit in by doing what everybody else did, but always felt like something was wrong. And then maybe the journey to transition and that sort of awareness is like Morpheus offering the pill. Well, you can be normal and be accepted and live a boring life where you're not true to yourself, where you can take the other pill and go into the Matrix and be yourself, but everything's going to get a lot harder. So that's once you look at it in that sort of light, the Matrix kind of completely changes. And that's really deep, and that's very cool, and it explains why that movie always meant so much to me, but I couldn't figure out why it was so good. I mean, the action scenes are really awesome, but like the reason why the first one really struck me, I couldn't put my finger on. And then when the sequels came out, the sequels were really very much not about that sort of inner struggle with fitting in versus being yourself and that sort of social discord. They were just actions, so they had all the cool action of the first movie, but they didn't have any of that grainy truth behind it, and that's why I really like the first one and the second too. It just kind of, why am I wasting my time? So that's cool. I'm sad that a very cool vehicle for introspection and self-exploration and self-actualization became money-making due to the sequels. But it's cool that the first one exists. Cloud Atlas is sort of similar, where instead of being about gender, it's about love and how love can change. It's the same love. So they have these two people throughout a long period of time who die and are reborn, and die and are reborn as many different people, as men who love men, and men who love women, and women who love women, and I don't know if there's women who love women, but there's just sort of like, it's the same two souls that are in love with each other, but it's expressed differently depending on what era they are, like which reincarnation they're in. And I think that's a really cool way of exploring the fact that love is love regardless of who is loving who. So that was really cool. That's not really trans, but it's a nice segue. But you can also look into, so they have a lot of, they have a few people, you know. Bono is a public figure, and Chad Bono, he's a public figure, and he was kind of like the first, wow, there's a trans guy out there, because some trans women are sort of becoming a little bit more, not famous, but there's exposure to that. And the rate of exposure for trans people is growing exponentially. Just like all media, it's just kind of exploding. It seems to be the hot topic right now. So that's kind of cool that Chad Bono made trans men sort of known. And there was a trans man in, I don't remember, America somewhere, whose wife couldn't have kids, so the trans man had the baby. So that's kind of neat. Like, you know, but sort of as an aside, like in the distance. Chad Bono, he's a fat guy. I can relate to that. But Chad Bono has had such a sensationalized life. Like, you know, Chad's parents were Cher and Sonny, and they were really famous. And you know, so Chad's been sort of exposed to the media for a long time, so the shock was like, we know this person, oh my god, we don't know this person. But beyond that, I don't know if Chad has anything to offer the trans community, beyond the fact that, hey, I'm trans and I'm also kind of famous. But he's not important in his own right. He's just important because he had important parents or famous parents. So, yeah, it's cool. There's a famous trans guy. So what? In other media, there's also, okay, so then there's like trans TV shows and indie media, like trans radio, which is part of Not Straight. And so they have these two trans people who are a couple who have a radio show, and they interview famous trans people, and by that I mean maybe in the indie movement, they're a musician and they happen to be trans, and you know, so they ask them questions and they talk about it. And they've interviewed a YouTuber who's a trans man, and they mostly do trans men, which is really funny because they're a trans female, trans male couple, but most of their guests are trans male. So they interview people like the guy who is a trans guy who runs the Self-Made Man, and they interview people who are musicians who happen to be trans, because I know the trans guy in the couple is also a musician. So the people that they talk to seem kind of interesting, but because they're all people who transitioned but had a skill, and then they became popular and nobody knew that they had transitioned, but they had a skill, like they're all musicians, or they make websites or whatever, so they're sort of pseudo celebrities, you know, B or C class celebrities, who happen to be trans. So it's like, ooh, you're trans and you have a talent, you know. And the character, so the people that they interview are sort of interesting, but the couple itself that runs the show is like repetitive and incredibly annoying. So if you watch one of them and then you watch another one, like one episode and then you watch another episode, they say the same things, like they're broken records, and I feel bad. Like, am I like that because I'm trans? Is trans the only interesting thing about me? Because otherwise I'm a boring dolt. Stuff like that. I haven't read any books with trans characters, but I'm maybe writing one right now, sort of. Because I feel that there's a lack of exposure of trans people in literary media, in prose and so on. So I don't really know of trans characters in books. There's a new TV show on the BBC called Hit and Miss, which has Chloe Sevigny, and let's not get started about that because it's not about the actor, it's about the content. And she plays, and this is really stupid, she plays a hitman. They don't call her a hitman, they call her an assassin, because hitman is gendered and assassin is not, but technically a hitman. So she's a hitman, or hit woman, if you will, who is a pre-op transsexual who has been doing HRT for a while and is killing people for money so that she can afford surgery. And she finds out that a relationship she had before she transitioned produced children, and that the mother of this child has passed on, and so, oh, drama. And in the show they do full frontals, and Chloe Sevigny is wearing, she's wearing, you know, it looks like an STP, frankly. It's what it looks like. And it does okay, it blends in okay. There's parts where you look at it and you're like, that's obviously fake. But they pick somebody who we have seen be so obviously feminine. And the character is very pretty and passes very well, and every man she meets falls instantly in love with her, and drama happens and whatever. So I'm kind of annoyed that they pick someone so feminine to play a trans woman, because I think, you know, if you look at the older versions of trans people in media, particularly trans women, they were always so masculine. Like, they were obviously biologically male prior to transition. And so they pick somebody who is a female, and while she has like a slightly square jaw, she's still very female. The idea of her playing a trans man seems like a 180 flip and just as offensive as if they pick somebody who is obviously not passing at all than if they pick someone who passes all the time except for the fact that there's a penis. So that kind of annoys me. But there was this interesting part whenever Chloe Sevigny tucks, which she does like 5 or 6 times throughout the show, the first season anyway. She uses a towel so she doesn't have to touch herself as she tucks. And that might be their way of showing dysphoria. That's kind of interesting. The show just seems so gimmicky, but I really enjoyed it. Like, I got really into it, but I was like, this is so gimmicky, but I still got swept up in it. So I'm kind of ambivalent. But my biggest complaint is, okay, so now she's not a monster, but she is, because there's still a lot of drama, but she does fall in love with a guy, and the guy finds out, but they still somehow manage to make it work, and he's still like, I love you even if you have a penis, and you can see kind of him struggling with the whole, like, she's trans, what do I do? But they make it work. So I'm kind of like, oh, that's so romantic. It's kind of like too easy. And also, she's too pretty. I don't know. I don't believe it. Sorry, trans women. I'm not putting you down. Just saying, I thought it was a little contrived, okay? Too many gimmicks. Yeah. So, I mean, the media is kind of all over the place. Like, the closer you get to now, the more accepting they are of at least the idea. Maybe not you specifically, but maybe the idea of trans people, it's okay, they exist. Let's talk about it. But then you get into television, and, you know, Maury and Tyra and all that stuff. They have these, like, sensationalism stories about this person is obviously a trans person. Well, not so obviously, but look, they're trans, but look how much they pass. And there's a lot of documentation now of, like, children who are transitioning. And while that's really great that it helps parents see that there are trans children, I can't help but feel that maybe they're being exploited just a little. So my reaction is mixed. It's crappy that there's not really much exposure, but it's crappy that when there is exposure, it objectifies us or shows us as something abnormal to be ridiculed or harassed or killed. And when it doesn't do that, then they morph the truth, artistic license, I guess, in order to make us super, like, not quite the way we are. If we are all very attractive and all of us pass, will it continue to implant the idea that we're somehow trying to cheat people and lie to them? Chloe Sevigny in Hit and Miss does suffer. You can sort of see the character struggling with, well, I'm trans and I want to love somebody, but I know that they're going to hurt me. So that's kind of realistic. But maybe the level of attractiveness in this person who was a grown man and then transitioned, maybe that's unrealistic. I'm very picky, and this is what I do. Look at movies and then whine about them. So I don't know. On one hand, I'm kind of glad that there's exposure. On the other hand, I don't really like the exposure that we're getting. And the trans people that are, you know, some of them are really funny. There's this really funny stand-up comedian who is a trans man who talks about, you know, I still feel like I'm part of the gay community because I used to be a lesbian and I have a girlfriend and we go to bars. And so there's truth there, but it's a trans person talking about their experience. And then when there's something that somebody else writes that involves a trans character, it stops being realistic. And when there's documentary or television shows that talk about, like, you know, this is a trans person and they're 5, or this is a trans person and they're 11, or whatever. Or in Hutunulu or whatever, there's trans people are considered their own gender. You know, it's like, okay. If you look at documentaries from the 80s, I think there was one from the 80s talking about gender and sex, and it involved a couple trans people. But it was such hoo-ha. Like hoo-ha. Like it's just not, I don't know. The exposure is good. The kind of exposure maybe not so good. But there is more exposure now than there was 5 years ago. And there's more exposure 5 years ago than there was 20 years ago. So, yes and no. Good and bad. There's exposure. Yay. In all kinds of things. Hooray. Value. Depends how people take it. Depends if people even know about it. Because people may be like, there's a trans person in that. I don't want to watch that. That's weird. And then they watch something else. And then the Matrix is really powerful, but it's subversive because it's sort of subtext. So if you're not looking for that subtext, you're not going to see it because it's subtext. So people who just watch the Matrix and just like it, but don't get that whole, I don't quite fit in, why don't I fit in, should I just be myself and not fit in, they're not gonna see it because it's gonna get lost in all the action. I'm juggling invisible balls. This is a really long video, for 30 minutes long, so I'm gonna stop. But thanks you guys for watching. Join me next week for week 30. And watch my personal channel. I got some news I'm going to be posting up there. You guys have a lovely week. I'm going to be super busy. Hopefully I'll have time to make a video next week. Catch you guys.